Hey, it's Lou and welcome back to Shade Shorts, some conversations that I've been enjoying in between the main seasons of the show. You'll hear my behind-the-scenes chats with Black radical art practitioners. And for the next few shorts, I'll be in conversation with the editors responsible for the most progressive and provocative independent art and culture journals. These chats will be snappy, providing you with signposts to my guests' inspiring work. You can take it from there at the end of the conversation by following the links provided in the podcast description. Today I'm in conversation with photographer, award-winning author of Afropean and guest curator of the Eyes Journal, Johny Pitts. So let's get into the chat. Enjoy. Firstly, I'd like to hear about your own journal, the Afropean.com, an archive of nearly 10 years exploring the social, cultural and aesthetic interplay of Black and European cultures. And what can our Shade friends expect to find when they go and check it out, and what inspired you to create it?
Yeah, well, the Afropean, which I should mention, I run with Nina Kamara, Yomi Bazue and Nata Lumin now. It started off just me with a kind of blog space, and then we got a bit of funding and turned it into a proper website, and they actually are all working much harder on it than I am at the moment, as I'm kind of promoting my various personal projects. But Afropean is really a place that I set up because I couldn't find it online. I was looking everywhere for a place that kind of spoke about what it's like to be Black in Europe. And it's kind of interesting saying that now, because I think there are so many more spaces that have opened up in the last 10 years. But at the time, there really wasn't any outlet for people to talk about what it was like to be Black in Europe, but also for my own writing and for the writing of people who around me. There was nowhere was publishing us. So I really set it up as a kind of platform for all the Black voices in Europe to share ideas and to share their stories. And I'm very proud. What I'm most proud of with Afropean is that anything that I missed with the book, I couldn't go everywhere, and with the book you have a finite amount of space. The great thing about the website is that people can say, oh, well, I'm from Slovakia. You didn't go to Slovakia in the book. And they can write about their experience growing up Black in Slovakia. Or, we've had people who grew up and talking about what it's like being a queer in the Isle of Wight, growing up Black, So all these intersectional elements that can be explored on the website, when maybe I couldn't have explored them in as much depth as I would have liked to with the book. So I feel like the website gave birth to the book, and now hopefully the book feeds back into the website.
You took that to your guest curation for issue 12 of The Eyes, which is titled B-Side, and it's a visual exploration of what it means to be Afropean. What led you to focus on this subject of work initially for your book? And a very simple question, what does it mean to be Afropean, Johny?
It's funny, every time I get asked that question, I think my answer becomes more and more sort of vague and complex, because, the notion does get challenged. Initially it was a place for somebody who feels both of and not of Europe, of and not of Africa, that liminal space in between, that kind of chimes with those of us who grew up Black in Europe. We kind of never quite feel fully European or fully African. I mean, with me, it's different as well, because Africa was kind of robbed from me by the transatlantic slave trade. So my father is African American, and it meant that I had nowhere to anchor myself, really. I was very much adrift, which is not the worst place to be adrift, but adrift in what scholars call the Black Atlantic, in that space between Africa, the Caribbean, America and Europe. All of my cultures kind of are born of those cultures, and especially like the Caribbean, which was kind of received culture, because even though I don't have any Caribbean heritage, that was the predominant Black identity in Britain. So very much I kind of grew up with a feeling like I was connected to the Caribbean somehow through the Black British community. but then I had these other elements in there as well. So yeah, really Afropean was a chance to suggest something that was whole and unhyphenated, that felt very coherent, but accepting of all these myriad influences that have sustained me and sustained the community that I know.
And music is obviously an integral part of our collective Afropean experience. Its influence on our culture features heavily in your issue of the Eyes as well. And I really enjoyed reading Roger Robinson's contribution, where he talks about the healing power of music, particularly the bass sound of dub and the Avashanti sound system. My influences were Caribbean as well, and I grew up as part of an extended Rasta family. So that was my experience as well. And I'm currently researching the healing power of dub myself at the moment, because I just don't think it's explored enough. And I just loved it that Roger touched on that. But I just wonder how you approach music's influence for this guest curation that you worked on.
Interesting. You know, Roger Robinson and I are working on a project together, a new book, and it's going to be a collaboration based on the Sweet Fly Paper of Life by Langston Hughes and the photographer Roy Decarava. So it's going to be my images and his poems,
Oh,
and
amazing.
we're dealing a lot with these resonances, these kind of these energies. You know, it's one thing to document the Black community or write a poem, but then there's another thing to capture the kind of the atmosphere
Yeah.
behind the experience, which is what I'm interested in. Paul Gilroy. I've got to stop bringing Paul Gilroy up in my interviews. I'm always hopping on about him, but you know, he's got a great body of work. He talks about Black vernacular culture, this notion of information that is encoded in sometimes abstract ways. And in fact, recently, something that I found very interesting was coming across an article from about 10 years ago in NME that was about a tribe called Quest. And in this article, it said there was no other band like a tribe called Quest that captured the surreality of the Black experience in America like they did. And I thought, what an interesting thing to think about, a tribe called Quest as a place of surrealism, and of a place of surrealism that is based upon the surrealism that is encoded in the Black experience in the diaspora. Because I think there is a surrealism there, and I think actually that surrealism is what very often gives so much life and so much beauty to forms of Black expression in the arts and in the creative fields.
And continuing with music, I love the conversation between yourself, Roger, and Alyssa Sheman with Mad Professor. There's just so much rich content there. There's an exploration of the 10-year history of Trace magazine, and I was like, before I saw that, I was like, am I the only one who remembers Trace magazine? It was just so brilliant to see it in there, and you showcase amazing photography from established and well-loved artists that we know so well, you know, Liz Johnson-Arthur and Sylvia Rossi and James Barner, but also there's a plethora of lesser-known artists' work. And the issue is titled The B-Side, which refers to the artistic endeavours which are equally as rich as the work of more maybe prominent photographers who are often overlooked. And I just think this is so important, and I just really vibed with this idea, because our more established culture journals, you know, our street journals, they've changed so much. And I really just think that there's a lack of offering there in terms of, you know, how they elevate emerging artists. You know, they talk to the idea of creating a space for new talent, but quite often don't. The mix of emerging and established artists that you incorporated was really important and interesting. And how did that editorial process work in terms of how you chose the B-side talent?
Great question. I remember Gary Young talking about the current British government and talking about how it's possibly the most ethnically diverse government we've ever had in this country. But he was arguing that it's not multicultural, right? Because it all emerges from one culture, and that is very often private school or Oxbridge. And so what you get is members of the Black community that are chosen because of how they fit in with the status quo. in these positions of power. And I feel like you get that expressed in the art world, in the fashion world very often, is
Right.
people who work within within the accepted parameters of the white establishment, you know?
Yes.
And so for me, what was really important is to not only bring race into the matter, bring black photographers working in Europe uh, into the fray, but then think about like class as well, and
Mm,
think about like the majority of the black people living in Europe uh, are from maybe what you might describe as working class backgrounds, maybe don't have as much economic power. What if we enter these spaces and instead of trying to like select photographers who might be acceptable by, I don't know, Magnum
mm,
or these big institutions, what if we say no? What if we reject that and say, well, let's have a look at the kind of logic that has emerged uh, from a black community that has grown up with less, or that is trying to figure out a different way, a different language, visual language. And that's really what the B-side was all about. So all of the photographers we chose, uh, I think they came with a different kind of aesthetic, that almost emerges from a kind of family album aesthetic or a kind of vernacular. And I began with two photographers, and that was Liz Johnson Arter
mm,
and Eddie Ochere,
mm.
who's based in Brixton. And I think through the work of these photographers, I saw, this different kind of of deal this different way of thinking about photography that embrace sometimes shakes and cracks, and this is a long tradition in the black photography world. People like Roy Decarava
Mhm,
dealt with shadows very often in his work, and
mm,
people like, I was just at a talk with the amazing Ming Smith, who was part of
mm.
the Kamonge workshop with
Yeah,
Roy
yeah.
Decarava,
Mhm.
and she was also talking about the uh, thinking of light as spirit and blurs and cracks, and so we wanted to this is probably, it sounds almost like the opposite of praise, but for me it's the highest of praise. Like, I
Mm,
feel like the work that you find in the B-side,
mm.
you could almost find it as a discarded photo on the
Yeah,
street
yeah,
of
yeah.
where it's
Yeah.
been documented. So you might
Mm.
find a photograph on the street of Brixton and say, "Oh, what's that?" And the kind of feeling tone of the work that's in the B-side, it almost feels like that, rather than someone coming in and documenting the space and then getting out and publishing it in the Guardian or whatever.
Yeah.
I felt like this was a different visual language.
Yeah, yeah, I totally understand that. It's kind of like what I was saying about these early like 80s and 90s culture journals that we used to like love so much and pore over, like ID. And I don't want to diss ID, but there's definitely been a massive change there. And they might try and incorporate the cracks and the shadows and all of those aberrations that perhaps would not go into the, like, the more glossy curated journals. But
Mm.
now I feel like the images in those street journals are highly curated to a sense where it's almost performance, and the kind of the reality of the experience that the photographer is having with a subject or in the particular environment that they're taking a picture is now so heavily curated for street journals that I just feel like it's just kind of lost its integrity, and we just don't get much of that kind of engagement with those experiences anymore. So I totally hear you there. And
It's
um,
true. I was just in Paris with Mohamed Borussia, who's one of the featured photographers in this the B side, and he's from the suburbs in Paris, from a working class Algerian background, and he won the Deutsche Bourse Prize
mhm,
recently, and
mhm,
so like he's become a bit of a darling of the photography world now. But he was saying it's so difficult for him because the work that is featured in the B side and that made him probably um, the most famous is
mhm,
his work Peripherique, which is about
mhm,
a photograph, staged photographs in Clichy-sous-Bois, where the 2005 riots kicked off.
mhm.
And it's an old body of work, actually. It was made between, I think, 2005 and 2008. But he was saying, like, now that that work's become quite famous, he's getting like calls from these fashion journal magazines saying, "Oh, could you go to the Bon? Could you go to the and make and do a 3-page spread for us?" And he said, it doesn't work like that. Like that body of work took me years, and sometimes in some cases it would take me like 6 months to make a single image.
Yeah,
Like this is not a case of going in there, getting some people in the right clothes to stand by some tower blocks. Like
yeah.
this is soul work that takes a long time.
I love the choice of contributors that you did bring in, writers as well as photographers, and they spoke about what Afropean means to them. And you had an array of different people commenting. You had the writer Thomas Chatterton Williams, and he said that one of the most pressing questions confronting Western democracies is how how are we to make our multi-ethnic societies work? And journalist Mina Salami said that the term Afropean makes room for borderless blackness, whilst also interrogating why blackness is an estranging conduit of identity in the first place. I just wonder how the contributors' expressions on the Afropean experience reached you. Did they surprise you in any way?
They didn't surprise me, just for the simple fact that I chose contributors who I knew would be surprising, if you know what I mean. So
Yeah, because Thomas can be a bit of a controversial
oh
character.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, yeah, for sure, and that's exactly why I chose him.
Mm,
Um, because the thing is with Thomas is he is a controversial character, and I don't agree with everything that he says. But
mm,
he is a great writer, and I think he's quite a brave writer, and so he has my respect because I think that even though sometimes I think he plays devil's advocate a little bit too much,
yeah, yeah.
I think he goes out on a limb, and
Hmm.
and it's and I think he's been honest from his own position.
Mm,
And I think the more I was reading the book the other day, I forget the author's name, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual,
hmm.
a classic book. I forget the title, but,
Mm,
we need varied opinions. It can't just be everybody, patting each other on the back saying you're doing great. I think
yeah,
like
yeah.
in a black intellectual scene, much like the Harlem Renaissance, where you had massive disjunction between somebody like Claude McKay and W.E.B. Du Bois, so many letters arguing amongst each other. Within that friction, fire emerges.
Mm,
And I think that that's what we need in the black community. Of course we need to support each other, but at the same time we need to thrive in intellectual scene, and I think Thomas really is a part of that. Also, like Carol Phillips, it was quite interesting, who's
mm,
one of my mentors.
mm.
His whole piece was how he didn't think Afropean necessarily worked.
Ah,
and
mhm.
I thought that was great, because that was the nature of my book. It wasn't me saying we're the Afropeans and this is great and I'm the head of the Afropeans. And, it was a journey, it was a process, it was taking a term that resonated somehow, deconstructing it, seeing how it worked in different spaces, and taking Afropean on a journey rather than enforcing a kind of a pre-designed destination. It was important that the goal really was the journey, and so I wanted that in the book. I wanted to pick writers who would really, really bring interesting perspectives on this term Afropean, so that the term can breathe,
Mm,
so that it's not something that gets too comfortable with itself, so that there is just real intellectual engagement. And that's specifically why I chose the writers I chose, because I knew that many of them were very, very supportive of the term Afropean, and would call themselves Afropean. Others wouldn't, and that's
mm,
great. It's great to have that balance of opinions.
mm. Did anything shift in you after um, working with all of the contributors in terms of your own experience of your relationship to being Afropean?
No, nothing changed really, because I've been working on this for a very long time.
Mm,
It just reminded me of certain things. I think with what Thomas was saying, I think me and Thomas agree on a lot of things in terms of like the destination, where as a community we want to go, and we want to go in a we want to live in a post-racial world. That would be great. Where we disagree, I think, is how we get there. And for
mm,
me, black radical politics is actually something that will help us get to that place. I think we can't, at the moment, we can't pretend that race doesn't exist because of the amount of racism, the amount of that we face. We have to organize. We have to have activism to challenge the structures that are in place that keep race alive. And I think once those structures fall, then we might be able to talk about a sort of a post-racial society. Also, with Carol Phillips, I thought it was very interesting that he was saying, for him, Afropean wasn't a word that he'd ever used, but he appreciated it as part of a process. And he talked about how the Black community in America sort of went through various incarnations of Blackness, from Negro to coloured to African American, and then maybe now back to people of colour. There are all these. There is a journey, and he thought that Afropean was just a stepping stone in this journey towards something that might work in a better way.
Yeah. And before we go, I'd like to just hear a little bit about the new body of work that you're focusing on.
So I contributed a photograph to Roger Robinson's masterful collection of poetry, A Portable Paradise. And he chose one of my photos for the cover. And it kicked off. I mean, I've known Roger for quite a few years. We actually met for the first time on a tour of Black British writers in America. And it was Black British writers who weren't very well known at the time. And it's kind of amazing to look back at now. It was put together by Speaking Volumes and Sharmila Bismahoon, whose partner is Linton Kwesi Johnson, and she put together this group of writers who she felt like were doing interesting things but weren't getting the love. And when you look at that group of writers now, it's like Jay Bernard, Bernardine Evaristo, Nick McCullough, Roger Robinson, award-winning writers, people who've gone on to do kind of amazing things. Not that awards are everything. So we met on this tour in 2016, and we did a poetry workshop in a maximum security prison. Which that had a profound effect on us because I don't know what we were expecting. Maximum security means probably the men we were teaching poetry to, were in for murder and things like that. But we saw ourselves in this group of men, and it really troubled us. So we've been talking back and forth for years. And then when Roger chose my photograph for the cover of his work, Portable Paradise, we decided we wanted to contribute in a more meaningful way. And I've got this archive of imagery that I've taken over the past sort of 10 years of the Black community in Britain. And then, so as Roger, he's got all these poems. And then we thought, well, what if we put together what we have and sent it to a publisher? And then they might give us money to produce some new work. And that's what happened. So HarperCollins took it on. And then we had this time to travel. We decided that Black Britain should begin with an itinerary. And the first thing we wanted to do was get out of London. So obviously we have to begin in a place like Brixton or Peckham, where I'm living at the moment. But we went along the River Thames eastwards to where Tilbury Docks is, of course, and Gravesend, where Pocahontas is buried. And then we circumnavigated the coast, and we decided we were going to make this a coastal trip because, of course, you have the notion of arrival of first generation immigrants arriving via the coast, but also you have notions of colonialism and the history of this country is at its coast, which people often forget. So you think about the narratives that places like Plymouth or Bristol, which is pretty much on the coast, have, or Liverpool, and these are very often unexplored in the notion of Black Britain. So that's what this journey is. It's a coastal trip looking for the Black community living in these places now, but also the history and charging our work with this history, this Black history that we found at the coast.
When can we see it?
Yeah, so it's going to be published the last week of September this year, but I mean, I thankfully won a foundation grant from the Ampersand Photo Works Foundation to help sustain my work, because I was traveling a lot and having to buy a lot of equipment for this journey. So, and what that comes with is a series of exhibitions. So as well as the book being released in in late September, working with Photo Works, I'll be putting on a series of exhibitions of the photographs with some of the poetry that Roger has written, beginning in Sheffield on the 10th of August at Graves Gallery, and then travelling to Edinburgh, and it'll be in the Stills Gallery there. And then we're currently looking for some venues, further south. But yeah, so look out for that as well, because I'm really excited. And we have to end the podcast, I suppose, but I'm really excited about this new body of work, because the book is one of the best things that I've ever done. And obviously with Roger's poetry, seeing this collaboration come to life has been extraordinary. But also with the exhibition spaces, what is amazing is that I can create. This book, by the way, is called Home is Not a Place. And so with the exhibition spaces, I'm creating a kind of home that is full of things that might chime with the Black experience in Britain. So I want to create these sort of homes for the Black community to come into these gallery spaces that sometimes might feel standoffish, and chill and read, look at the work, and feel really at home. So these spaces are kind of Black psychic spaces.
I'm just so happy to see, to talk to you, but also to see how your work has developed on from Afropean. And thank you so much, Johny, and keep in touch.
Thank you so much, Lou, and thank you for it's people like you who are working on helping to support and nurture the culture that are doing the real hard work. So I really appreciate you and this podcast.
Thank you so much.